Something is terribly wrong in Emily's life, but she doesn't even realize it. A fragile girl, always hungry, always cold, surviving each day with nothing but a stale sandwich and silent pain. But the truth is far worse than anyone could imagine. When she stumbles upon hidden letters in her attic, she begins to unravel a mystery buried deep in the past. Who is she, really? Why does her father refuse to answer her questions? And what dark secret has kept her in the shadows for so long? You won't believe what happens when the pieces finally come together. Watch until the end, and don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Emily's small fingers trembled as she clutched the crumpled napkin that barely held together what was supposed to be her lunch. The sandwich was cold, stale, and had a strong sour smell that made her stomach twist, but not in disgust, in hunger. Hunger had become something normal to her, a constant companion that gnawed at her ribs and whispered in her ear every second of the day. She had learned to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, just like she had learned to ignore the whispers of her classmates when she pulled out her lunch every day. She sat alone at the farthest table in the cafeteria, away from the loud chatter of kids who never had to worry about when their next meal would come. "Emily, why does your sandwich smell like that?" A voice suddenly broke through the noise, soft but cautious. She froze. She hadn't even noticed anyone approaching her table. Slowly, she lifted her eyes and met the gaze of a girl she barely knew. Samantha, one of the more popular kids. Her stomach tightened, not just from hunger but from the growing embarrassment. "It's fine," Emily mumbled, forcing herself to take a bite, her throat burning as she swallowed the rancid taste. She had trained herself to eat quickly so she wouldn't have to taste it, so she wouldn't have to acknowledge how wrong it was. But Samantha didn't leave. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying her. "Do you want part of my lunch? I have extra." "No," Emily snapped before she could stop herself. Her heart pounded. No one had ever offered her food before, and she didn't know how to react. If she accepted, what would that mean? Would people start asking questions? Would they find out what she had been hiding? Samantha took a step back, startled by Emily's reaction. But before she could say anything else, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Emily exhaled in relief. She could escape now. She grabbed her lunch bag, shoving the half-eaten sandwich back inside before anyone else could see it, and hurried toward the exit. But the day wasn't over. The gnawing pain in her stomach only grew worse as the hours passed. By the time she made it to her final class, she could barely sit up straight. Something wasn't right. She had ignored hunger pains before, but this was different. Felt sharp, deep, twisting inside her like a knife. She pressed a hand against her stomach, her fingers trembling. "Emily?" Miss Roberts' voice was gentle but firm. She had been watching Emily closely for weeks, suspecting something was wrong but never having enough proof to act. "Are you okay?" Emily swallowed hard, willing herself to nod, but her body betrayed her. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over her, and before she could stop it, the words tumbled from her lips. "My stomach hurts." The room went silent. Miss Roberts' face paled as she took a step forward. Emily looked down at herself, confused, and that's when she saw it. Her shirt was damp, not with sweat but something else. Something dark, something spreading. Miss Roberts inhaled sharply, her hands flying to her mouth. "Someone call the nurse. Now!" Her voice was urgent, trembling with something close to panic. Emily blinked, the world spinning around her. She barely registered the chaos happening around her as students scrambled out of their seats, some gasping, others whispering. She could hear someone running down the hall, shouting for help. Miss Roberts knelt in front of her, her hands shaking as she lifted Emily's shirt just slightly. What she saw made her breath hitch. She reached for the phone on her desk with trembling fingers and dialed a number she never thought she'd have to call. 911. "What's your emergency?" Miss Roberts' voice cracked as she spoke. "I have a student here. She's in severe distress. Her stomach. There's something wrong. She stopped herself, trying to remain calm. "Please, send an ambulance immediately." Emily's vision blurred. Her body felt too heavy. too cold. She could hear Miss Roberts talking, but the words didn't make sense anymore. The last thing she saw before everything faded was the horrified look on her teacher's face. And then nothing. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion when Emily opened her eyes. Bright lights, a white ceiling, a soft, rhythmic beeping sound. She blinked sluggishly, her throat dry. She was in a bed, but not her bed. The air smelled strange, sterile, like cleaning supplies and something metallic. "Sweetheart." The voice was soft, familiar, but laced with worry. Emily turned her head slightly and saw Miss Roberts sitting beside her, her eyes red as if she had been crying. "You're in the hospital," she said gently. "Do you remember what happened?" Emily tried to think, but everything felt foggy. She remembered the cafeteria, the pain, the classroom, the ambulance. Her breath hitched as flashes of everything came back. "My dad," she whispered suddenly. "Where's my dad?" Miss Roberts hesitated. "He was here earlier," she admitted carefully. "But, Emily, the doctors had questions. And so did the police." Emily's heart pounded. "The police?" Miss Roberts reached for her hand, squeezing it. "Sweetheart, they found something. Something they need answers about. And I think you might have found something too." Emily's mind raced. The letters, the attic, the name she had never heard before, Madeline Whitmore. Everything she had been uncovering piece by piece was finally coming to light. She wasn't just a hungry girl with no food. She wasn't just a child with a painful secret. She was something else, someone else. And now there was no turning back. The rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the sterile hospital room, a steady reminder that Emily was still here, still breathing, still trapped in the chaos that had become her life. She shifted slightly, her limbs heavy, her head aching as if she had been underwater for too long. The scent of disinfectant clung to the air, making her stomach turn. She had never been in a hospital before, never had anyone take her to see a doctor when she was sick. It was strange, being somewhere so clean, so bright, so different from the dimly lit, suffocating space she called home. Miss Roberts still sat beside her, her expression filled with a kind of worry that Emily wasn't used to. It was the kind of concern that felt real, that wasn't masked behind tired sighs or distant stares like the ones her father gave her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of the thin hospital blanket, gripping it tightly, as if grounding herself in something solid. "How long have I been here?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Miss Roberts glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Emily. "Almost 24 hours, she said softly. "You gave us all quite a scare." Emily's stomach twisted, not from hunger this time, but from something deeper, a gnawing unease that curled around her ribs like a vice. She didn't like being here, didn't like the way the fluorescent lights exposed everything, made it impossible to hide. And then she remembered the letters, the attic, the name she had discovered. Her breath hitched. "My dad," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "Where is he?" Miss Roberts hesitated. "Emily, sweetheart, the doctors had a lot of questions about your health. When they ran some tests, they found out that you've been severely malnourished for a long time." Her voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. The police had questions too. Emily felt her stomach clench, a wave of nausea washing over her. The police? That meant they had started looking into things. That meant people were paying attention now. And that was dangerous. She tried to sit up, ignoring the way her limbs protested, weak and unsteady. "I need to go home," she blurted out. Miss Roberts shook her head. "No, Emily, you need to stay here. The doctors—" "You don't understand," Emily interrupted, her voice rising in desperation. "I can't be here. I have to go home before—" She stopped herself, her breath shallow. "Before my father finds out what I know." Miss Roberts' face softened, but there was something else in her eyes. Something knowing, something cautious. "Emily," she said gently, "there's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Emily swallowed hard, her fingers twisting into the blanket. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to spill everything. The attic, the letters, the strange name that didn't belong to her but somehow felt like it did. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when she didn't know who to trust. A soft knock at the door made them both turn. A nurse stepped inside, smiling gently. "Emily, sweetheart, there's someone here to see you." Emily's breath caught in her throat as a familiar figure stepped into the room. Her father. His face was unreadable, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. His eyes, always tired, always distant, flickered with something she couldn't quite place. He barely glanced at Miss Roberts before stepping closer to the bed. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice flat. Emily forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression neutral. "Hi, Dad." Miss Roberts stood up, her back straightening. "I'll give you two some time," she said carefully, though her gaze lingered on Emily, as if silently reminding her that she wasn't alone. As soon as the door closed behind her, the tension in the room thickened. Her father sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "What were you thinking? Scaring everyone like that?" Emily clenched her jaw. "I didn't do it on purpose," she muttered. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well." She let out a humorless laugh. "Would you have even noticed?" His expression hardened. "That's not fair, Emily." Emily felt something snap inside her. Not fair. Her voice shook, but not from fear. From something deeper, something she had been holding in for too long. "You don't even care, Dad. You don't care that I go to school hungry every day. You don't care that I have to eat rotten food just to survive. You don't care about anything." His jaw tightened. "That's not true." "Then why won't you tell me the truth?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. His posture stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Emily's heart pounded. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. She could see it now, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He knew. He had always known. "The letters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found them." For a moment he didn't move, didn't blink. The silence stretched between them like an unspoken threat. And then, finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "You shouldn't have gone looking, Emily." Her breath caught. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't even trying to. "Who is Madeline Whitmore?" she asked, her voice trembling. His eyes darkened. "Forget that name." "I can't," she whispered. "Because I think it's me." His entire body went rigid. The room felt too small, too suffocating. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anything else. Regret. "You don't understand," he muttered, shaking his head. "I did what I had to do. I kept you safe." Emily's throat tightened. "From what?" His lips parted, as if he was about to say something, but then he stopped himself. Instead, he just sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "You need to stop asking questions, Emily." But she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. Before she could press further, the door swung open, and a nurse stepped inside. "Sorry to interrupt," she said kindly, "but the doctor needs to run a few more tests." Her father took a step back, stuffing his hands into his pockets again. "I'll be back later," he muttered before turning and walking out. Emily watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew one thing for certain now. Her father was lying to her, and whatever he was hiding, it was something big. Emily lay awake in the hospital bed long after her father had left, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning in endless circles. The name Madeline Whitmore echoed in her head like a distant whisper, growing louder each time she tried to silence it. Who was she? And why was her father so desperate for her to stop asking questions? The more she thought about it, the more she realized. She had never truly belonged in that house, had never felt like she fit into the life her father had built around them. But if she wasn't Emily, then who was she? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned her head to see Miss Roberts standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile on her face. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently. "Can I come in?" Emily nodded. Miss Roberts stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I spoke with the doctors, she said carefully, taking a seat beside the bed. They said you're doing better, but they're still concerned. They've asked some questions about your home life. Emily's stomach tightened. She knew what that meant. They think I'm being neglected, don't they? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Roberts hesitated. They're worried about you, Emily, and so am I. Emily swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. Would telling the truth change anything, or would it just make things worse? Miss Roberts reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Sweetheart, I know something's wrong. I've known for a while, but I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Emily looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. I don't know what to say. Miss Roberts sighed, her expression softening. How about this? I'll ask you a question, and you only have to answer if you want to. Emily nodded hesitantly. Miss Roberts took a deep breath. Did you find something at home? Something that scared you? Emily's heart pounded. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she whispered, yes. Miss Roberts didn't push, didn't ask for details. Instead, she simply nodded, as if that answer alone confirmed everything she had already suspected. I want you to know, she said softly, that no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. You have people who care about you, people who will fight for you. Emily wanted to believe her, but deep down, she wasn't sure if anyone could help her now. The next morning, Emily was discharged from the hospital. Miss Roberts insisted on driving her home, and Emily didn't argue. She wasn't ready to be alone with her father yet. As they pulled up to the small, rundown house, Emily felt her stomach twist. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. Felt colder than usual, emptier. Do you want me to come inside with you? Miss Roberts asked gently. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. No, I'll be fine. Miss Roberts didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Okay, she said softly. But if you need anything, anything at all, you call me, all right? Emily nodded and stepped out of the car. As she walked toward the house, she could feel Miss Roberts watching her, waiting, as if hoping she would change her mind. But Emily didn't look back. She took a deep breath and pushed the front door open. The house was silent. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. Dad? She called hesitantly. No answer. She moved cautiously through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father's coat was still hanging by the door, his keys still on the table. He was here, somewhere. She found him in the kitchen, sitting at the small, worn-out table, staring down at something in his hands. When she stepped closer, she saw what it was. A letter. One of the letters from the attic. Her breath caught. You kept them, she whispered. Her father didn't look up. I told you to stop looking, Emily. She clenched her fists. I can't. I need to know the truth. His hands tightened around the paper. The truth won't change anything. Yes, it will, she insisted. Because I think you've been lying to me my whole life. Finally, he looked at her. His eyes were tired, haunted. Emily, he said, his voice rough. You don't understand what you're asking. Then make me understand. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. You were never supposed to know, he murmured. I tried to protect you from this. From what? He hesitated, then finally spoke the words that changed everything. From the life you were meant to have. Emily's breath caught. What does that mean? He looked away, as if searching for the right words. Your name, he said finally. Your real name isn't Emily. Her heart pounded. It's Madeline Whitmore. Everything inside her froze. No, she whispered. That doesn't make sense. He exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. I know it doesn't, but it's the truth. Emily shook her head. No, my mom. She wasn't your mother, he said softly. And I'm not your father. The world tilted. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. No, that's not. I took you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A long time ago, I took you from the life you were supposed to have. Emily staggered back, her mind racing. Why? His eyes darkened. Because they didn't deserve you. She felt sick. Who? The Whitmores, he said simply. The people who let you slip through their fingers. The people who never came looking. Emily's stomach turned. That's not true. I found the letters. They were looking for me. Her father flinched. They never stopped looking, she whispered, realization sinking in. You lied to me. Emily. No, she said, her voice shaking. You stole me. Her father's face crumpled, as if the weight of those words finally crushed him. I raised you, he murmured. I gave you a life. You gave me a lie. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned and ran, ignoring his voice calling after her. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing. She had to find the truth. Emily ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she was looking for. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that house. Not after what her father, no, not her father, the man who had raised her, had just admitted. The words echoed in her head over and over again. You were never supposed to know. You're not Emily. I took you. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet, the world spinning around her. Too big, too overwhelming. She had spent her whole life believing she was someone else, believing that the life she had was hers. But now she didn't know who she was at all. Her feet carried her down the quiet streets of her small town, past houses she had walked by every day, past people who had never looked at her twice. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, a ghost trapped in a life that didn't belong to her. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she turned a corner and found herself in front of the school. It was empty now, the hallways dark, the playground silent. But there was one person who might still be inside. One person who had been trying to help her all along. She pushed through the heavy front doors, her hands trembling as she made her way down the dimly lit hallway. The office lights were still on. Without hesitating, she stepped inside. Miss Roberts looked up from her desk, her face filling with surprise and concern the moment she saw Emily. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? I thought you were resting at home. Emily shook her head. I can't go back there, she whispered, her voice cracking. Miss Roberts stood immediately, moving toward her. What happened? Emily's hands clenched at her sides. He lied to me, she said, her throat tightening. Everything was a lie. Miss Roberts placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Emily, slow down. Tell me what's going on. Tears burned behind Emily's eyes, but she forced herself to keep speaking. I found letters in my attic. Letters from people looking for me. People who I think are my real family. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. And tonight, he told me the truth. Miss Roberts' face was unreadable, but Emily could see the way her fingers curled slightly, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. What truth? Emily took a deep breath. I'm not Emily, she whispered. I never was. My real name is Madeline Whitmore, and I was stolen from my family. For a long moment, Miss Roberts didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Emily felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest, the reality of her words sinking in. She had said it out loud. She had admitted it, and now there was no taking it back. Finally, Miss Roberts inhaled sharply. Her eyes filled with something Emily couldn't quite read. Sweetheart, she said gently, this is serious. I know, Emily said, her voice shaking. That's why I came to you. I don't know what to do. I don't even know who to trust. Miss Roberts hesitated for only a second before squeezing Emily's hand. You did the right thing by coming here. Emily exhaled shakily. What do I do now? Miss Roberts was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. We need to find proof, she said finally. Something that confirms what you found. If you really are Madeline Whitmore, then someone somewhere has been looking for you. And we need to find them. Emily nodded, determination settling deep inside her chest. I think I know where to start. It was late by the time they pulled up to Emily's house. Miss Roberts had insisted on coming with her, and Emily was too exhausted to argue. The lights inside were still off, the air thick with tension as they stepped onto the porch. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The house was eerily quiet. Her father, no, the man who had raised her, was nowhere to be seen. Where is he? Miss Roberts asked softly. Emily shook her head. I don't know. They moved through the house in silence, Emily leading Miss Roberts to the attic door. Her hands were unsteady as she pulled it open, the stairs creaking beneath their weight as they climbed up into the darkness. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old paper filling Emily's nose as she knelt beside the box where she had first found the letters. She hesitated for only a second before pulling it open. The letters were still there. Miss Roberts knelt beside her, picking one up carefully. These are old, she murmured, running her fingers over the faded ink. Emily nodded. I don't know why he kept them. Maybe he thought I'd never find them. Miss Roberts unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the words quickly. Her breath caught. Emily, look at this. Emily leaned in, her eyes widening as she read the first few lines. To my dearest Madeline, if you ever find this, please know that I never stopped looking for you. Her stomach twisted painfully. The handwriting was neat, elegant, filled with sorrow. It was signed at the bottom with a name Emily didn't recognize. Evelyn Whitmore. Emily's breath hitched. Evelyn Whitmore, she whispered. That's my real mother. Miss Roberts' grip on the letter tightened. Emily, we need to take this to the police. Fear gripped Emily's chest. But what if they don't believe me? Miss Roberts turned to her, her expression firm. Then we'll make them believe you. Emily swallowed hard, nodding. This was it. She was finally going to learn the truth. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Miss Roberts' car, gripping the letter so tightly that the edges of the paper bent beneath her fingers. The world outside the window felt surreal, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows against the pavement as they drove through the quiet town. It didn't feel real. None of this did. The weight of the words on the paper pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. To my dearest Madeline, she had read it over and over again, but each time, it only made her stomach twist more violently. She had a mother, a real mother, a woman who had been looking for her all this time, and she had never known. Emily, Miss Roberts' voice was gentle but firm, grounding her back to reality. Are you okay? Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. I don't know, she admitted after a moment. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. Miss Roberts' grip on the steering wheel tightened. You're still you, sweetheart. No matter what happens, you're still the same girl you were yesterday. You just have more of the truth now. Emily wanted to believe that. She really did. But the truth had already started to unravel everything she thought she knew. And the more she uncovered, the more she feared that nothing about her life had ever really been real. The police station came into view, a small but intimidating building that sat at the edge of town. The fluorescent lights inside flickered slightly, casting a dull glow onto the pavement as Miss Roberts pulled into a parking spot. Emily's stomach clenched. You don't have to do this alone, Miss Roberts said, reaching over and giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Emily nodded, inhaling sharply before pushing the car door open. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she forced herself forward. The station was quiet when they stepped inside. A tired-looking officer sat behind the front desk, sipping from a coffee cup that had the word Best Dad printed on the side in faded lettering. He barely glanced up at them until Miss Roberts cleared her throat. Good evening, she said. We need to speak to someone about a missing person case. The officer raised an eyebrow. A missing person? His gaze flickered to Emily. Who's missing? Miss Roberts placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. She is. The officer blinked. I'm sorry, what? Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed the letter onto the desk. My name is Emily Parker, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At least, that's what I've always been told. But I think my real name is Madeline Whitmore, and I think I was kidnapped when I was a baby." The room fell into silence. The officer's expression shifted, confusion and surprise flickering across his face. Slowly, he set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "You think you were kidnapped?" Emily nodded. "I found letters in my attic. Letters from my real mother. And tonight, the man who raised me admitted that he took me." The officer didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he stood up. "Give me a second," he said before disappearing into the back. Emily felt her heart pounding against her ribs. She turned to Miss Roberts. "What if they don't believe me?" Miss Roberts squeezed her shoulder. "They will." The minutes stretched on painfully before the officer returned, this time with a woman in a neatly pressed uniform. Her expression was unreadable as she studied Emily carefully before gesturing for them to follow her. "Let's talk in my office." Emily's legs felt like they were made of lead as she followed the woman down the hallway. The office was small but neat, with stacks of case files piled neatly along the desk. The woman, Detective Harris, according to her nameplate, gestured for them to sit. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice calm but firm. Emily inhaled shakily. "I don't remember anything before I was with him," she began. I grew up thinking my name was Emily Parker. But a few days ago, I found a box of letters in my attic. They were old, hidden away, and they were all from a woman named Evelyn Whitmore. In the letters, she was looking for someone named Madeline. And then tonight, the man who raised me, he told me the truth, that I'm not really Emily, that I was taken. Detective Harris's expression didn't change. "You said his name is Parker?" Emily nodded. "James Parker. He's the only father I've ever known." The detective scribbled something down in a notebook before glancing back up at her. "Did he tell you why he took you?" Emily hesitated. "He said he did it to protect me, that the Whitmores didn't deserve me." A flicker of something crossed Detective Harris's face, something Emily couldn't quite read. Miss Roberts cleared her throat. "Detective, if this is true, if Emily really is Madeline Whitmore, then her real family could still be looking for her. Is there any way to find out?" Detective Harris leaned back in her chair, considering something. Then, after a moment, she stood. "Stay here," she said before stepping out of the office. Emily's fingers curled into fists. The waiting was unbearable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. She had spent her whole life not knowing the truth. Now, she was desperate for answers. Finally, the door opened again. Detective Harris stepped inside, but this time, her expression had changed. She was holding a file. Emily's breath caught. The detective sat down, opening the file carefully. "I just pulled up an old missing persons report," she said. "Madeline Whitmore disappeared from her home over 10 years ago. She was last seen when she was 3 years old. Her parents, Evelyn and Richard Whitmore, searched for her for years. But the case was eventually closed due to lack of evidence." Emily's throat tightened. "That's me," she whispered. Detective Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. Emily gasped. It was a picture of a little girl, no older than 3, sitting on a swing, her chubby fingers clutching the chains as she laughed at the camera. Her eyes were wide and bright, her dark hair curling slightly at the ends. Emily felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. It was her. The proof was right in front of her. "Emily," Detective Harris said gently, "I think you're right." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her and pulling her under. She had spent her whole life feeling like something was missing, like there was a hole inside of her that she could never quite explain. And now she knew why. She wasn't Emily Parker. She was Madeline Whitmore, and everything was about to change. Emily sat frozen in the chair, her hands gripping the edges of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The photograph of the little girl, stared back at her from the detective's desk, proof that her entire life had been a carefully crafted lie. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She wasn't Emily Parker. She wasn't the girl she had always thought she was. She was Madeline Whitmore, a child who had been stolen and raised by a man who had spent years convincing her that she belonged to him. Detective Harris watched her carefully, her fingers tapping lightly against the file in front of her. "Emily, Madeline, listen to me," she said gently. "This is a lot to take in, I know. But I need to ask you something, and it's very important." Emily's throat felt tight. She wasn't sure if she could speak, but she forced herself to nod. "Has James Parker ever told you anything about why he took you? Anything about your real family?" Emily swallowed hard. He said they didn't deserve me, that they let me go, that they didn't come looking." Her voice cracked at the last part, because she knew now how much of a lie that had been. Miss Roberts placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder, but she didn't speak. It was Detective Harris who sighed and leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "Madeline, that's not true. Your family never stopped looking for you. Your mother, Evelyn Whitmore, she searched for years. She filed missing person reports, worked with private investigators, went to every news station that would listen. She fought for you." Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Then why did they stop looking?" Detective Harris hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Because the case was closed. There was never enough evidence to prove what had happened to you. And your mother passed away a few years ago." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Emily blinked, her vision blurring. She's gone." Detective Harris nodded, sympathy clear in her eyes. "I'm sorry." A sob caught in Emily's throat. She had been holding on to this idea that maybe, just maybe, her real mother was out there somewhere waiting for her. That if she could just find the truth, she could go back to the life she was meant to have. But now that hope had been ripped away. She would never get to meet Evelyn Whitmore. She would never get to hear her voice, to ask her the questions that had been burning in her mind since she first found those letters. The mother who had spent years searching for her was gone. Miss Roberts wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close as silent sobs racked her body. "I know this is a lot," she murmured softly. "I know it hurts, but you're not alone, sweetheart. You still have people who care about you." Emily pressed her face against Miss Roberts' shoulder, clinging to her words even as grief swallowed her whole. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Detective Harris gave her a moment before continuing. "Madeline, your father, Richard Whitmore, is still alive, and he doesn't know that we've found you yet." Emily's breath hitched. Her real father. She had a father out there. One she had never met, one who had spent years believing that his daughter was lost forever. And now he was about to find out the truth. Emily wiped at her tears, her voice shaky. Does he still want me?" Detective Harris's eyes softened. "Sweetheart, I don't think he ever stopped wanting you." The words settled deep in Emily's chest, filling a void she hadn't even realized was there. She had spent so many years feeling like she didn't belong, like something inside of her was missing. And now she finally understood why. She had a family, a real family, and now she was about to meet them. The drive to the Whitmore estate was quiet, but Emily's mind was anything but. Miss Roberts sat beside her in the car, offering her quiet reassurances every few minutes, but Emily barely heard them. Her heart was pounding too loudly in her ears, her nerves threatening to consume her whole. She had no idea what to expect. Would her father recognize her? Would he want her back? Would she even feel like she belonged there? The car pulled up to a long, winding driveway, lined with tall oak trees that stretched high into the sky. The house, no, the mansion, came into view, its grand exterior almost intimidating. Emily swallowed hard. This had been her home once, and yet she had no memory of it. Detective Harris turned to look at her. "Are you ready?" Emily wasn't sure if she would ever be ready, but she nodded anyway. The door opened before they even had the chance to knock. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something Emily couldn't quite place. He was tall, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, his suit pressed but slightly disheveled, as if he had thrown it on in a hurry. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "Madeline." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, wanted to confirm what he already knew. But the words wouldn't come, so she nodded. The sound that came from him was almost inhuman, a strangled sob that he tried and failed to suppress. And then, before she could react, he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly that it nearly took the breath from her lungs. "My baby," he choked out. "Oh my God. My baby girl." Emily's body stiffened at first, the hug unfamiliar, the warmth foreign. But then, slowly, she let herself melt into it. She had spent years wondering why she never felt like she belonged. Now, for the first time in her life, she finally understood. She was home. Emily stood frozen in her father's embrace, her body stiff, her mind struggling to process everything happening around her. His arms were wrapped around her tightly, as if he were afraid that if he let go, she would disappear again. His breath was uneven, and she could feel the way his chest rose and fell in ragged, unsteady movements. The moment should have felt warm, comforting. But instead, all Emily felt was an overwhelming sense of disorientation. This man, this stranger, was her real father. She had spent years wondering why she never felt like she truly belonged, why something always felt just slightly off about her life. And now, here was her answer. Her entire existence had been built on a lie. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her arms and wrapped them around him in return. The movement felt foreign, unnatural, but she let herself sink into the moment, just for a little while. When Richard Whitmore finally pulled back, his hands cupped her face as if he needed to convince himself that she was real. His eyes, deep blue and filled with unshed tears, scanned her features, memorizing every detail. "I never thought I would see you again," he whispered, his voice cracking. "For so many years, I imagined this moment, prayed for it, and now you're here." Emily didn't know what to say. There were too many emotions fighting for control inside of her. Relief, fear, sadness, confusion. Instead, she just nodded. Behind them, Miss Roberts cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Whitmore, I know this is a lot to take in, but Emily has been through so much. She's only just learned the truth about everything." Richard looked at Miss Roberts for the first time, as if just realizing she was there. He nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. I just..." He turned back to Emily, his hands still trembling. "There's so much I want to say. So much I need to tell you." Emily swallowed. I don't know where to start." Richard took a deep breath, nodding as if he understood exactly how she felt. "Come inside," he said gently. "Let's talk." She hesitated for only a moment before stepping past the threshold, into the house she had once called home but had no memory of. The inside of the Whitmore estate was nothing like the home she had grown up in. Everything was pristine, polished, untouched by time. The ceilings stretched high, the chandeliers casting warm golden light onto the grand staircase that led up to the second floor. Large windows overlooked a sprawling garden, filled with perfectly trimmed hedges and flowers in full bloom. It was beautiful, but it didn't feel like hers. Richard led her to a large sitting room, where a fireplace crackled softly against the far wall. He gestured for her to sit, and she hesitantly sank into the plush couch. Miss Roberts sat beside her, a silent but steady presence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard exhaled shakily. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. "I don't want to overwhelm you, but I also don't want to waste another second not telling you everything you deserve to know." Emily looked down at her hands. I need to understand. Why did this happen? How was I taken from you?" Richard's expression darkened. "That's the part of the story I've never been able to get answers to," he said quietly. "One night you were in your crib, safe and sound. The next morning, you were gone." Emily's stomach twisted. "No sign of a break-in?" Richard shook his head. "None. The police investigated, but there were no forced doors, no broken windows. It was as if you had just vanished into thin air." He ran a hand through his hair. "Your mother and I... God. We searched for you for years. We never gave up. But every lead led to nothing. Eventually, the case was closed. But Evelyn never stopped believing that you were out there somewhere. Emily's throat tightened at the mention of her mother. I wish I could have met her. Richard's face filled with sorrow. She would have loved you so much, Madeline. You were her entire world. He paused. She wrote you letters. She always believed that somehow, someday, you would find them. Emily sucked in a shaky breath. I did find them, she admitted. In the attic of the house I grew up in. The man who took me, James Parker, he kept them. I don't know why, but he never threw them away. Richard's jaw tightened. Parker. Emily frowned. Do you know him? Richard hesitated, but then he nodded. James Parker worked for our family. He was our chauffeur. The air was sucked from Emily's lungs. What? He worked for us for years, Richard explained. He was quiet, kept to himself, but he was always reliable. Then one day he disappeared, right after you did. Emily's hands clenched into fists. He always told me that my real family didn't want me, she whispered, anger bubbling in her chest. That no one was looking for me. Richard's eyes darkened. That man stole everything from us. And now he's going to answer for it. The weight of those words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Miss Roberts leaned forward. What happens next? Richard exhaled. Now we prove who she is. He turned to Emily. We'll do a DNA test, and once it's confirmed, we'll go to the authorities. Emily nodded. She was ready for that. She needed the truth to be out there once and for all. But deep in her gut, she knew this wasn't over. There were still too many unanswered questions. And James Parker was still out there. Emily sat in the Grand Whitmore estate, feeling like a guest in a life that was supposed to be hers. The walls were adorned with portraits of people she didn't recognize, family members she had never met, memories she was never a part of. Everything was too polished, too pristine, too different from the small, creaking house she had grown up in. She felt like she was intruding on someone else's home, like an imposter stepping into a story that wasn't truly hers. Richard sat across from her, watching her carefully, as if afraid she would disappear again if he looked away for too long. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped from his untouched cup of tea, the weight of the moment pressing heavily between them. Madeline, he said softly, his voice cautious, uncertain. Emily flinched at the name. Still didn't feel like hers. She had spent so many years being Emily Parker, living a life that was now nothing more than an illusion. But Madeline Whitmore? That name belonged to a girl who had vanished a lifetime ago. A girl who had a family that loved her. A girl who had been stolen in the night. She wasn't sure if she could ever be that person again. I don't know who I am, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's face filled with sorrow. I know this is overwhelming, he said gently. I don't expect you to just remember everything overnight. But you're home now, and we'll figure this out together. Emily nodded, but her thoughts were tangled. Was this really home? Could she ever feel like she belonged here? A knock at the door broke the silence. A butler stepped in, his posture stiff and formal. Sir, Detective Harris is here to see you. Richard stood immediately. Send her in. Emily's stomach tightened as Detective Harris stepped inside, a folder tucked under her arm. She offered Emily a reassuring nod before turning to Richard. Mr. Whitmore, we've already started the process of confirming the DNA match. It'll take some time, but with the evidence we already have, it's looking solid. Richard exhaled in relief, sinking back into his chair. And Parker, Detective Harris's expression darkened. We're still looking for him. His house is empty. No sign of him anywhere. Emily felt a shiver crawl up her spine. He ran. It seems that way, Detective Harris admitted. But he won't get far. Now that we know what happened, we'll make sure he's found. Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that this was over. But deep down, she knew James Parker too well. He had lived a life built on lies. He had spent years hiding the truth. He wasn't the kind of man who would simply give up and disappear. Richard's jaw tightened. When you find him, I want to be the first to know. Detective Harris nodded. Of course. She hesitated, then turned back to Emily. "There's something else. Something I wanted to talk to you about privately." Emily stiffened. "What is it?" Detective Harris pulled out the folder she had brought with her and set it down on the table. She opened it carefully, revealing several old documents. "We went through some of the old case files, trying to find any connections between Parker and your disappearance. And we found something." Emily leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What?" Detective Harris hesitated before sliding a single document toward her. "A financial record. A transaction made just a few days before you went missing." Emily frowned, staring at the paper. "What does that mean?" Richard's face paled as he scanned the document. His fingers clenched around the edge of the paper. "Someone paid him." Emily's heart nearly stopped. "Paid him?" Detective Harris nodded. "It looks like James Parker didn't just take you on his own. He was paid to do it." The room went silent. Emily's stomach twisted painfully. This whole time, she had thought that Parker had taken her out of some twisted belief that he was doing the right thing. That, in his own deluded way, he had convinced himself that he was protecting her from a family he believed was unworthy. But this changed everything. "You're saying..." Emily's voice wavered. "You're saying someone hired him to take me?" Detective Harris nodded. "And we're trying to find out who." Emily's mind reeled. Who could have done this? Who could have wanted her gone? Richard's hands were shaking as he stood up, pacing the room. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Why? Why would someone want to take my daughter away?" Emily swallowed hard. "Who had something to gain from me being gone?" Detective Harris exhaled. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out. But I have a suspicion that whoever it was, they didn't expect you to ever come back." A chill ran down Emily's spine. The mystery wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the financial record lying on the table in front of her. The numbers, the date, everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Someone had paid James Parker to take her. It wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't a desperate man convincing himself he was doing the right thing. It was a plan. A calculated, deliberate plan to steal her away. Her mind spun with questions. Who? Why? What could anyone have possibly gained by taking her from her family? Richard stood stiffly beside her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The air in the grand sitting room was thick, suffocating, the weight of the revelation pressing down on both of them. Detective Harris cleared her throat. "We're still investigating," she said carefully. "But based on the records we found, the money didn't come from Parker himself. It was wired to him through an anonymous account." Emily's chest tightened. "But there has to be a way to trace it back to the person who sent it, right?" Detective Harris hesitated. "That's what we're working on. But whoever did this, they covered their tracks well." Richard ran a hand down his face, exhaling shakily. "Someone wanted her gone," he muttered. "Someone wanted to take my daughter from me, and I never knew." Emily felt her heart clench. All these years, Richard Whitmore had lived believing she was lost to him forever. And now, he was discovering that it hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been planned. A cold realization settled in her bones. Whoever had done this, they might not be done. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they find out I'm back?" Detective Harris met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "That's something we need to be prepared for." Emily's pulse quickened. She had spent years living in obscurity, invisible, hidden in the quiet shadows of a life that had never truly been hers. But now the truth was out. The world knew. And if the person responsible for her kidnapping was still out there, they knew too. Richard turned to Detective Harris, his voice firm. "I want protection for my daughter. If someone tried to take her once, they could try again." Emily shivered. She hated the thought of being watched, of living in fear. But deep down, she knew Richard was right. Detective Harris nodded. "We'll take precautions." Emily's fingers curled into fists. She had spent so long feeling powerless, lost in a life she hadn't chosen. But now she had the chance to fight back. And she wasn't going to let fear stop her. That night, Emily lay awake in the bed of a room that was supposed to be hers. The Whitmore estate was massive, elegant, and filled with echoes of a life she had never lived. The room was decorated in soft colors, the furniture expensive and untouched, as if frozen in time. A childhood she never got to have, preserved in the delicate lace curtains and the neatly arranged bookshelves filled with stories she had never read. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind raced with thoughts of Parker, of the person who had taken her from this place, of the people who had spent years believing she was gone, and of the person who had orchestrated it all. She sat up, pushing the heavy blankets off her, and padded toward the window. The estate grounds stretched out beneath her, dark and quiet under the moonlight. But something felt off. She squinted, pressing her forehead against the glass. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. Her breath caught. Someone was watching the house. Her hands shook as she turned, moving quickly to the door. She stepped out into the hallway, the massive house eerily silent. She didn't know where Richard's room was, but she didn't care. She had to tell someone. Her feet barely made a sound against the polished floors as she made her way down the hall. But as she reached the grand staircase, a voice stopped her. "You shouldn't be here." She froze. The voice was low, quiet, but unmistakable. James Parker. Her heart nearly stopped. Slowly, she turned. He stood at the bottom of the staircase, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He looked different than she remembered, less put together. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating. She took a step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. "How did you get in here?" Parker's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have my ways." Fear curled in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" Parker exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I want you to stop this, to stop digging, to stop asking questions." Emily clenched her fists. "I can't. I deserve to know the truth." Parker's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into, Madeline." The sound of her real name coming from his lips sent a shiver down her spine. "Who paid you?" she demanded. "Who wanted me gone?" Parker's expression darkened. "It doesn't matter." "Yes, it does," she shot back. "Because whoever it was, they might not want me back." Silence. A confirmation. Her stomach twisted. "They know I'm here, don't they?" Parker didn't answer. Emily felt her breath come in shallow gasps. "Who are they?" Parker took a slow step forward. "Let this go, Madeline. Forget about the past." Emily's heart pounded. "I can't." His eyes flickered with something almost like regret. "Then you're in danger." She took another step back. "If you ever cared about me at all, you'll tell me the truth." Parker exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked at her for a long moment, as if debating something. Then finally he spoke. "There's more to this than you know," he said quietly. "And if you keep pushing, you're going to find out the truth." Emily swallowed. "Isn't that what I want?" Parker's gaze hardened. "Not this truth." A chill ran down her spine. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Emily's chest ached with the weight of it all. There was more than she knew, more than she had ever imagined. And in the darkness of the Whitmore estate, she realized one terrifying thing. The truth wasn't just about her past. It was about her future, and it was about to change everything. Emily stood in the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding so violently in her chest that she thought it might burst. James Parker's words echoed in her mind, weaving through her thoughts like a slow-moving poison. "There's more to this than you know. And if you keep pushing, you're going to find out the truth." She wasn't sure how long she had stood there, frozen, the weight of his presence still lingering in the air even though he was gone. The silence of the Whitmore estate pressed in around her, suffocating, heavy with the ghosts of secrets long buried. What did he mean? What was he still hiding? She turned sharply, heading down the hallway with quick, determined steps. She needed to find Richard. He had to know that Parker had been here, that he had somehow gotten into the estate undetected. But as she reached Richard's study, the door was already ajar. She hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. Richard sat at his desk, his head in his hands, his posture heavy with exhaustion. Papers were spread out before him. Documents, photographs, pieces of a puzzle that Emily hadn't yet put together. "Dad." Her voice was quiet, but the word felt foreign on her tongue. Richard looked up sharply, his tired blue eyes locking onto hers. "Madeline," he breathed, his expression immediately shifting from exhaustion to concern. "What is it?" Emily hesitated, then stepped closer. James Parker was here. Silence. Richard's jaw clenched, his entire body going rigid. "What?" Emily nodded, her hands trembling. "I saw him. He was inside the house." Richard pushed back from his desk so suddenly that the chair nearly toppled over. "How did he get in?" His voice was sharp, urgent. "Did he hurt you?" Emily shook her head. "No, but he warned me." Richard's eyes darkened. "Warned you?" Emily swallowed. "He told me to stop looking for the truth. He said I didn't understand what I was getting myself into." Richard exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "That man," he muttered, pacing the room. "I knew he would try something. I knew he wouldn't just disappear." Emily's stomach twisted. "Dad," she said carefully. "He said someone paid him to take me." Richard stopped pacing. His shoulders tensed. For a moment he didn't speak. Then slowly he turned to her. His face was unreadable, his eyes unreadable. "I know," he said finally. Emily's breath caught. "What?" Richard sighed, stepping toward the desk, gripping the edge as if bracing himself. "Madeline, there's something I need to tell you." Emily's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Richard hesitated. His fingers curled into the wood of the desk. "You weren't taken by accident." The room tilted. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. "I don't understand." Richard exhaled, his eyes meeting hers. "You were taken for a reason." A cold wave of nausea rolled through her. "What reason?" Richard's voice was heavy, pained. "Because of your mother." Emily's chest tightened. "Mom." Richard nodded. Evelyn wasn't just a Whitmore. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful families in the city. And she inherited something valuable. Something that someone else wanted. Emily's stomach churned. What was it? Richard's expression was grim. "A fortune." Emily's mind reeled. "A fortune." Richard nodded. Evelyn's family left her a massive inheritance. One that was meant to be passed down to you. Emily's breath hitched. "But when you disappeared," Richard continued, "the inheritance was never transferred. Without an heir, the money was tied up in legal battles controlled by trustees. Someone benefited from you being gone, Madeline." Emily's hands trembled. "Who?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Your uncle." The words hit her like a physical blow. "My uncle?" Richard nodded. "Evelyn's brother. Your mother trusted him. But after you disappeared, everything changed. He took control of the estate, the family assets. He had everything to gain from you never coming back." Emily's mind spun. It didn't make sense. Her uncle? Someone from her own family? "But why would he do that?" she whispered. Richard's voice was heavy with regret. "Because he didn't think you'd ever come back." Emily took a step back, shaking her head. "So he paid Parker?" Richard nodded grimly. "It was never confirmed. But the timing, it all lines up." Emily's stomach twisted painfully. "Does he know I'm back?" Richard's expression darkened. "If he didn't before, he does now." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Emily barely touched her breakfast. She sat at the dining table, staring at her untouched plate, her thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "Madeline," Richard's voice was gentle, but firm. "You need to eat." Emily shook her head. "I can't. Not until I know what's going to happen next." Richard exhaled. "Detective Harris is coming back today." We're gonna figure this out. But I promise you, you're safe here. Emily wasn't so sure. Before she could respond, the house phone rang sharply, slicing through the tension in the air. Richard stood immediately, striding over to answer it. Hello? A pause. Then, Richard's entire body stiffened. Emily stood, her heart pounding. Dad! Richard swallowed hard, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Who is this? He demanded. Another pause. Then Richard's face darkened. You stay away from my daughter, he snapped, his voice shaking with anger. You hear me? You stay away. Emily's blood ran cold. He hung up the phone with a forceful slam, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. Emily stepped forward slowly. Who was it? Richard turned to her, his expression grim. Your uncle, he said quietly. He knows. Emily's breath hitched. And he's coming for you. A shiver crawled down her spine. The past wasn't done with her yet. And now, she was about to face the man who had stolen everything from her.